بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So today is lesson 35 in our series on this book, Taqreeb Tadmuriyyah. And in the previous lesson, or the previous few lessons, what we were looking at, we were looking in a bit more detail about affirming for Allah His attributes and negating from Allah certain attributes, right? So if you remember at the very beginning, we mentioned a general broad principle as to how we speak about Allah. What's our methodology when we speak about Allah, Allah the Creator, the Lord of the heavens and the earth, the Lord of Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? How do we describe Allah? And we said that the general principle is that we describe Allah with whatever He described Himself with and what His messenger described Him with. Or we affirm for Allah what He affirmed for Himself. And then on the other side, we negate from Allah whatever negated from Himself and whatever His messenger negated from Himself. So upon this means that when we speak about Allah and describe Him, we are only describing Him based upon what He Himself conveyed to us of knowledge. So this was something we looked at the very beginning, some broad principles. And now here at the very end of the book, what we are doing is we are looking in a bit more detail about negation and affirmation. So in the previous three lessons, we were looking at what is the correct way to negate from Allah. What is the correct way? And we said that the way of the prophets and the messengers and the revealed books and the way of the companions of the Prophet is that when we negate from Allah, we negate three categories of things. We negate things which in and of themselves are blameworthy attributes, such as death, such as blindness, such as dumbness, such as tiredness, such as giving birth, right? These are all blameworthy attributes in and of themselves. They are deficiencies and blameworthy attributes. So Allah is free of these things. That's the first category that is negated in the Quran. The second category is any imperfection or shortcoming in His actual attributes, right? So Allah has power, there is no deficiency in His power. Allah has hearing, there is no deficiency in His hearing. Allah has life, there is no deficiency in His life. Unlike the deficiencies in the creatures, so our life, our hearing, our seeing, our knowledge, there are flaws and limitations within this knowledge. That's the second thing which is negated in the Quran. And the third category that's negated is there's no likeness. There isn't any likeness between Allah and His creation. There's no likeness between His attributes and the attributes of the creation. So this is what we find in the Quran. However, due to the effect of, or the influence of Greek philosophy and foreign influences, the Muslims were affected by certain ideas, just as the Jews were, just as the Christians were before Islam. They were affected in the same way. There were many groups who appeared and they deviated from these principles, and they began to bring vague and ambiguous principles, right? So from those is they say that when we are going to negate from Allah, we are going to simply follow the principle that we negate any resemblance from Allah. This is kind of vague, and we looked at that in detail in the previous two lessons. I won't go into the details again. Another way, a second way, is they say, well, our principle in negating for Allah is to negate tajseem, which is embodiment, right? And this is again going back to Greek philosophy, the philosophy of Aristotle, the metaphysics and the physics of Aristotle, and we explained that in the previous lesson, right? This is their principle, that anything that implies Allah is a body, we will negate it from Allah, right? And this means that you can't describe him with attributes, you can't describe him with names, you can't describe him with actions, on account of this foreign philosophy, Greek philosophy. And the third thing is negation of what they call hawadith, which means they negate that Allah acts according to His will. Allah acts according to His will. Allah has actions tied to His will, because they believe this somehow.
Are you talking in the mic because the ladies can't hear you?
No. Got to switch it on. So the third incorrect principle that's relied upon by some of the people of innovation is they say our principle in negating from Allah is to say that He yukhalif al-hawadith, right? That He opposes and is different to all newly emerged things. And what they mean by this is to deny Allah has actions which He performs according to His will, because they believe this implies Allah has changed, and anything which changes cannot be eternal, cannot be uncreated. But this is false, because in the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal, He clearly affirms that He is the doer of whatever He wills, and whenever He wishes or wants something, then He simply says it to it be, and it bees, right? So these are statements and actions of Allah tied to His will. Anyhow, this was our discussion regarding negation, right? So we are contrasting between the true methodology and between innovated principles and foundations which bring ambiguity and confusion. So in today's lesson starts from this point. This was a recap of the previous lesson. Today, lesson 35, we are going to do the same thing that we did with negation. We are going to do the same thing with affirmation, right? So we're going to show what is the correct way to affirm attributes for Allah Azza wa Jal, and how to avoid any pitfalls, any ambiguities, things of that nature, right? So the Shaykh says, in this final section of the book, he says that as for the principle وَأَمَّا الضَّابِطْ فِي بَابِ الْإِثْبَاتِ, as for the principle regarding affirmation, and then he mentions a sentence which is a key sentence here to take note of, right? So this sentence, the next sentence to follow, is the key sentence to note down, to look at, to remember, because it's like the crucial detail. So he says, وَأَمَّا الضَّابِطْ فِي بَابِ الْإِثْبَاتِ, as for the principle of affirmation, then فَإِنَّ نُثْبِتُ لِلَّهِ تَعَالَى مَا أَثْبَتَهُ لِنَفْسِهِ مِنْ صِفَاتِ الْكَمَالِ عَلَى وَجْهٍ لَا نَقْصٌ فِيهِ بِأَيِّ حَالٍ مِنَ الْأَحْوَالِ. Okay, so I'll translate that. What this means is that when it comes to affirming things for Allah, then the principle which is followed is that we affirm for Allah the Exalted whatever He affirmed for Himself of the attributes of perfection. Right? So this now is an important qualification here, right? That we affirm for Allah what He affirmed for Himself of the attributes of perfection, in which in a way in which there is no deficiency in them whatsoever, right? So this is an important qualification at the end. We don't simply say, we say we affirm for Allah what He affirmed for Himself of the perfect attributes in a way in which there is no deficiency in them whatsoever, in any situation. What's the evidence for this? What's the evidence for this point, for this statement? The evidence is that Allah Azza wa Jal, He said, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ, which means to Allah belongs the loftiest similitude, which means the loftiest description. Right? That to Allah belongs the most perfect description. So this means that nothing of any shortcomings, of any defects, of any blameworthy attributes can be attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. Now, the Shaykh says that the attributes of Allah, all of them are perfect attributes, irrespective of whether we speak in affirmation. So for example, we say Allah is Al-Hayy, the ever-living. Allah is the ever-living. Right? This now is an affirmation. We've made an affirmation. Allah is the ever-living. He has perfect life. Or, so irrespective of whether we affirm something for Allah or whether we negate something for Allah. So if we say Allah is the one who never dies, we negate death from Allah. Right? Alladhi la yamut. Right? So either way, whether we affirm or whether we negate, we are always, these are attributes of perfection. Right? When we say Allah is ever living, it's an attribute of perfection. When we say Allah does not die, it's an attribute of perfection because it implies the opposite. Right? It implies the opposite. That's why, as we mentioned earlier previously, there is no such thing as just a pure negation in itself. Right? Right? We don't say Allah is not deaf, Allah is not blind, Allah does not become tired, and just that's it, just the pure negation. No. Every negation that we make, it always implies the perfect opposite. Right? So when we say Allah is not deaf, it means He is perfect in hearing. Allah is not blind, He is perfect in seeing. Allah is not ignorant, He is perfect in knowledge. Right? So irrespective of whether we are making an affirmation or a negation, in both cases, these are always descriptions and attributes of perfection. Okay. So once that is clear, so is all of that clear so far? Right? Now we're going to show where the mistake can enter. Right? So imagine I say to you that my principle in describing Allah is to simply make affirmation while denying any resemblance. Right? Do you remember from the previous lesson we explained why it is wrong to make the principle in negation to say I negate from Allah, I negate anything from Allah without resemblance, anything which has resemblance. We said this is vague, ambiguous, right? We gave reasons why. Now, if someone says I affirm for Allah without making any resemblance, right? Is this a sound principle? Is this a sound principle? Can we rely upon that principle? Why? Because what can happen? What can somebody say?
We have life, just about
Huh?
life.
Huh?
There's resemblance in that from that angle.
No, it's not because of that. Like if we make the principle in affirmation, if we say our principle in affirming things for Allah is to say we will affirm things for Him but deny resemblance. Okay, now, as the Shaykh says, someone can come along and say, well, I affirm for Allah that He, for example, He becomes sad, He cries, He becomes hungry, He becomes thirsty, and He becomes tired. But I negate any resemblance between the way Allah becomes sad, tired, and so on and so forth. There's no resemblance between that and between how the creation becomes sad and tired. Do you understand? Right? So it means that anyone can come along and they can bring these blameworthy attributes of imperfection and ascribe them to Allah. Like a Christian can come along and say, well, Allah is able to give birth. But I deny there's any resemblance between how Allah gives birth and how the creation gives birth. And he can make that argument in the same way. He'll say, well, I'm just saying the same thing that you say. Because you say, Allah Azza wa Jal, He has hearing, seeing, and but you say it doesn't resemble what's in the creation. So I say the same thing, that Allah can give birth, that Allah can become, remorseful, but not in the way, it doesn't resemble how the creation becomes remorseful and gives birth and so on and so forth. You understand? So what we are showing here is that if you make your principle in affirming things for Allah, in describing Allah, to be this statement here, I affirm for Allah whilst negating any resemblance. This is not precise and exact, because it allows, as we've seen, any person to come along and say, well, I can describe Allah with sadness, grief, giving birth, tiredness, taking a rest or whatever. But I'm not implying in any way that this somehow resembles the way the creation becomes tired, takes a rest, gives birth. Now you can allow anybody to come and ascribe anything to Allah whilst claiming, oh, but I'm not making any resemblance. Allah knows best how it is with him. Do you understand? So that's why at the beginning I said, pay attention to the actual correct way or the definition of affirming. What did the Shaykh say? He said, فَإِنَّا نُثْبِتُ لِلَّهِ تَعَالَى, we affirm for Allah whatever he affirmed for himself, min sifatil kamal, of the attributes of perfection. Right? So the only things that can be ascribed to Allah are attributes of perfection, because that is what is ascribed to Allah in the Quran and in the Sunnah. Right? So, and in a way in which there is no deficiency whatsoever. So now we know that when someone comes along and says, well, like a Christian might come along, or a Shia, a Rafidi, because historically in the past they were from the Shia, they believed, some of the extreme groups, they believed they gave Allah like human qualities. They gave him human qualities, right? Just like the Christians do with Jesus, peace be upon him. So they can come along and say, well, I affirm for Allah, and some of them will go to the extent that they will say, as the Shaykh says, Allah has, for example, a liver, and Allah has a stomach, and Allah, astaghfirullah. They will say these things, but I negate any likeness or resemblance, just in the same way that you say that Allah Azza wa Jal has maybe like a face, a hand, or he becomes pleased or becomes angry or whatever. Right? But this is incorrect, because it violates the principle, first of all, of affirming for Allah only what he affirmed for himself, and secondly, Allah only affirms for himself attributes which are attributes of perfection. Right? So that's why that when we make affirmation for Allah, we are affirming something very specific and specifically defined. Right? What is it? We affirm for Allah what he affirmed for himself of the attributes of perfection in which there is no deficiency whatsoever. All right? So then the Shaykh says, look, it's possible for someone to come along and he can start ascribing anything to Allah in terms of attributes and deficiencies. And then he can also start making arguments and start saying, well, hold on a minute, just because I affirm for Allah these things, sadness, grief, tiredness, actual organs that humans have, like a liver and stomach, whatever, what's your proof that he doesn't have these attributes? Just because Allah did not specifically mention these attributes does not mean that they don't exist, right? So, like, you then enter into this type of argument, and which is false, obviously. But the answer to this argument is, well, we only describe Allah with what he described himself with, of the attributes of perfection in which there is no deficiency whatsoever, right? And these attributes, are not, they are negated from Allah, because if you ascribe to Allah, eating, drinking, well, this means Allah is in need. And Allah is Al-Ghani. He is the one who is free of all need. And this is a deficiency. And if you say Allah has like organs, like a liver and a stomach, well, these are only needed if you consume food. So this again is negated in the Quran. Allah negates this because he does not need food or drink. He does not need any sustenance from anybody, nor does he. He's al-Ghani, as we said. He is free of all need, worthy of all praise. Right. So even though these things are not specifically negated, they are negated through other ways, by way of other names of Allah, the ever-living, the one who is al-Ghani, the one who is, free of any need. So, coming really towards the end of, this is a very short section really, you should be able to see how, if we just keep this kind of vague principle of, we affirm for Allah but negate any resemblance or likeness. This is open-ended. It allows anybody to come along and ascribe anything to Allah while just saying, well, no, I'm not affirming any resemblance. I'm just saying Allah sleeps, Allah becomes tired, but it's not like how it happens in the creation. Right? This vague principle allows anyone to ascribe anything to Allah Azza wa Jal, which is why this is not the correct principle. Just in the same way as we did with negation, right? You can't say, well, our principle in negation is we'll negate from Allah, we'll negate all resemblance between Allah and His creation. Well, that's not true either, because there has to be some degree of resemblance in the meanings, right? Allah has knowledge, we have knowledge. Allah has power, we have power. Allah has hearing, we have hearing. Allah has seeing, we have seeing, right? We understand the meanings of what we are saying here. But as for the realities, then obviously we don't know. There is no resemblance in the realities, right? So we can't negate resemblance altogether from all aspects. And in the same way here, when we make affirmation, we can't rely upon just that principle. We affirm for Allah and then negate any resemblance. Rather, it's something very specific. We affirm for Allah what He affirmed for Himself of the attributes of perfection. Sleep is not from the attributes of perfection, right? Giving birth is not from the attributes of perfection. Forgetfulness is not from the attributes of perfection. Being sad or remorseful is not from the attributes of perfection, right? These are things which you find. Some of these things are ascribed to Allah in the Old Testament, in the Torah, and in the distorted kind of previous revelations that ascribed some of these attributes to Allah Azza wa Jal. So this really brings us, to be honest, this is pretty much the essence of the point being made here in this final section, and we can stop here really, because then second half of the book starts now on Al-Qadr. So what we can do, if you want, we can just stop here, and if there's any kind of questions or any issues about anything that we've discussed previously, maybe for the next 15-20 minutes we can just go through that. But just to make that clear then, or just to make sure that is this principle clearly understood, that when we are affirming for Allah, it is something very specific and it's qualified with a qualifier, right? That we affirm for Allah the attributes of perfection, sifatul kamal, right? Not just any attribute to which we apply the negation of resemblance. No, it's only the attributes of perfection. So that's the essence of the point in the final chapter, in the final section. So now we have a very clear idea of both affirmation and negation, and we should be very quite easily able to see the mistakes being made by whether it's the Jews or the Christians, or whether it is Muslims who've deviated from these principles. We should very easily be able to recognize why their speech is wrong and which principles they are violating, right?